In the early morning hours of April 26, 2015, a quiet stretch of farmland in northeastern China looked almost completely untouched by human presence. The fields surrounding the foothills of Changbai Mountain had been abandoned for months, buried beneath a thick layer of late winter snow. During that time of year, the land offered very little reason for anyone to pass through. Crops had not yet been planted, the roads were narrow and uneven, and the wind that swept across the frozen fields carried a kind of silence that made the entire area feel distant from the rest of the world. It was the kind of place where, if something unusual happened, it might remain unnoticed for days. That morning, a local villager walking across one of those snow-covered fields noticed something lying ahead in the distance. At first, it looked like a pile of dark fabric partially buried in the snow, the sort of thing that might have fallen from a truck or been left behind by someone passing through the area days earlier. But as he walked closer, the shape slowly became more defined, and the moment he realized what he was actually looking at, he immediately stopped. Lying face up in the middle of the white field was the body of a woman. Police from Luhe County arrived shortly after the call was made. The scene they stepped into was eerily still. The body had been lying there long enough that animals from the surrounding mountains had already begun to disturb it, making identification nearly impossible at first glance. What remained of the woman's face had been severely damaged by wildlife, but something about the rest of the body immediately caught the attention of the forensic team. Aside from the damage caused after death, there were very few visible wounds anywhere else. That detail alone raised the first troubling question. Because if the woman had died violently in this remote field, investigators would normally expect to see signs of struggle, defensive wounds, blood patterns, or disturbances in the snow around the body. Instead, the surrounding area appeared strangely quiet. The snow around her had only a limited number of marks, and most of them formed a single long trail that extended several meters behind the body. Investigators followed that trail carefully. It stretched across the snow for roughly 16 meters, forming a shallow groove that suggested something heavy had been dragged across the frozen ground. The pattern was narrow, uneven, and continuous, the kind of mark that might appear if someone had pulled a body by the arms and slowly dragged it to its final position. There were no tire tracks nearby, no footprints indicating multiple people, and no clear sign that a vehicle had ever entered the area. Whoever brought the body here likely arrived on foot, and that meant the killing had probably happened somewhere nearby. When forensic examiners began their initial inspection, they noticed something else that made the case even stranger. Around the woman's neck, beneath the collar of her clothing, faint pressure marks formed a curved pattern that wrapped around the throat. The bruising suggested strangulation, a slow and deliberate method that required close physical contact between victim and killer. But perhaps the most unusual detail was what they found on the woman's wrists. Both wrists showed deep circular marks, the kind that typically appear when someone has been tightly bound with rope or cord. Yet there were no clear injuries indicating that she had fought back. That absence of resistance puzzled investigators. In most cases where a victim is restrained before being killed, signs of struggle are almost unavoidable. Scratches, bruises, torn clothing, something that indicates the victim tried to escape. But here, the woman's body showed almost none of that. It almost looked as if she had allowed herself to be restrained. At that moment, the investigators standing in the frozen field were already beginning to sense that the story behind this death would not be simple. The victim had no identification, no phone, no bag. Even her shoes were missing. Whoever left her here had removed nearly every object that could reveal who she was. For a while, it seemed as though the woman had simply appeared in the middle of the snow without any connection to the outside world. But during a more careful search of the clothing, one small and almost invisible detail changed the direction of the investigation. On the front of the woman's coat was a decorative pocket, the kind that exists purely for appearance and is often too small to hold anything meaningful. It was barely large enough to fit a fingertip, but when one of the investigators pressed gently against the fabric, he felt something inside, a tiny folded object hidden within the lining. When they carefully pulled it out, they realized it was a train ticket. The ticket had been folded tightly and tucked into that miniature pocket as if someone had intentionally hidden it there. The printed route showed a journey from Shenyang to a small station in Liaoning province, dated April 21st, exactly 5 days before the body was discovered. and printed on the ticket was a name, a man named Zhao Lei. At first glance, the discovery seemed like the first real lead in an investigation that had almost no clues. But as detectives would soon discover, that small piece of paper would lead them into a chain of coincidences, misunderstandings, and unanswered questions that would make this case far stranger than anyone expected. Because the man whose name appeared on that ticket would insist he had never even met the woman found in the snow. For several days after the discovery in the snow-covered field, investigators in Liuhe County faced a frustrating problem that often determines whether a case moves forward or stalls indefinitely. They had a body, but they had no name. Without identification, every other part of the investigation became exponentially more difficult. There were no documents on the victim, no phone, no bag, no personal belongings that might point toward where she had come from. Even her clothing offered little help. The garments were inexpensive and common, the kind sold in countless small markets across northern China, making it nearly impossible to trace where they had been purchased. At that stage, the woman lying in the snow was not a person in the eyes of the investigation. She was simply an unidentified victim. The forensic team was able to determine a few basic details. The victim was believed to be between 32 and 37 years old. She stood approximately 158 centimeters tall, with a slender frame that suggested she had not lived a life of physical labor. Her time of death was estimated to be around 5 days before the body had been discovered, placing it very close to April 21st. That date immediately caught investigators' attention because it was the exact same date printed on the train ticket that had been hidden inside the small decorative pocket of her coat. The coincidence was difficult to ignore, but even with that connection, the ticket only led them to a name that seemed to have no clear relationship with the victim herself. Detectives began the long process of searching missing person reports from surrounding cities and provinces. In many homicide investigations, this step eventually produces a match. Families report someone missing, and the physical description begins to align with the victim's characteristics. But in this case, the search initially led nowhere. Days passed with no reports that matched the woman found in the field. No relatives came forward. No employer called the police. It was as if the woman had vanished from her previous life without anyone noticing. Then, almost by coincidence, a report came in from a police station in Yingkou, a coastal city in Liaoning province, located hundreds of kilometers away from the remote farmland where the body had been discovered. A woman had arrived at the station to report that her younger sister had suddenly disappeared several days earlier. The missing woman's name was Huang Yuzhen. When officers compared the physical description from the missing person report with the forensic information from Liu County, the similarities were immediately apparent. The age range matched. The height matched. Even the clothing described by the sister appeared similar to what investigators had found on the body. Because the victim's face had been severely damaged, visual identification was nearly impossible. But when DNA samples from Huang Yuzhen's family were compared with the victim's remains, the results confirmed what everyone had begun to suspect. The woman found in the snow was Huang Yuzhen. Once investigators finally had a name, the investigation began to reveal pieces of the life she had been living before that final journey. Huang Yuzhen was originally from Yingkou and had spent most of her adult life there. She had been married once, but the marriage had ended in divorce several years earlier. After the separation, she lived alone and supported herself through a combination of small businesses and occasional informal work. Her financial situation was unstable, but according to relatives, she managed to get by. In her spare time, she enjoyed social gatherings and frequently played mahjong with friends and acquaintances. Those who knew her described her as outgoing and sociable, someone who enjoyed meeting new people and forming connections quickly. That personality trait may also explain why she had been involved in several romantic relationships over the years. At the time of her death, investigators learned that she had recently been seeing a younger man named Lin Hongchun. The two had met through mutual friends during social gatherings where mahjong was played. Lin was significantly younger than Huang Yuzhen by more than a decade, and their relationship had never been fully accepted by her family. According to Huang Yuzhen's sister, the relationship between the two had always been unstable. There had been arguments, temporary breakups, and reconciliations that seemed to repeat over time. But in the days before Huang Yuzhen disappeared, Something had changed. She told Lin Hongchun that their relationship was over. This time, she said the decision was final. Her explanation surprised him. Huang Yujin claimed that she had recently met another man, someone older and supposedly more financially stable. She said the relationship was becoming serious, and she was planning to move to Shenyang to start a new life with him. To Lin, it sounded sudden and almost unbelievable. But Huang Yujin appeared determined, even confident about the decision. She told him that this new relationship represented a fresh start, something more stable than the uncertain life she had been living before. After that conversation, Lin attempted to call her several times later that night. Each call went unanswered. It would be the last time anyone close to Huang Yujin heard from her. For investigators, that revelation introduced a new question that suddenly became central to the entire case. If Huang Yujin had been planning to begin a new life with another man, then that person might be the last individual to see her alive. But at that moment, the identity of this mysterious man remained completely unknown. Her family had never met him. Her friends had only heard vague references to him, and none of them knew his name. Somewhere between Yingkou, Shenyang, and the remote mountains of Liuhe County, Huang Yujin had traveled to meet someone she trusted. And within days of that meeting, she ended up alone in a snow-covered field hundreds of kilometers away from home. Once investigators finally confirmed the identity of the woman found in the snow as Huang Yujin, the case seemed to gain direction almost immediately. With a name now attached to the victim, detectives could begin reconstructing the final days of her life, who she spoke with, where she traveled, and most importantly, who might have been the last person to see her alive. But before the investigation even reached that stage, there was still one piece of evidence that had been sitting quietly in the case file from the very beginning: the train ticket. It had been discovered folded tightly inside the tiny decorative pocket on the front of Huang Yujin's coat, a place so small and inconspicuous that investigators almost missed it during the first search of the body. The ticket showed a route between Shenyang and a town in Liaoning province, and printed on it was a name, Zhao Lei. At first glance, the discovery appeared almost too convenient. In a case where the victim had been found with no identification and no belongings, suddenly there was an object directly linked to a specific person. Naturally, detectives began asking a simple question. If the ticket belonged to Zhao Lei, why was it hidden inside the victim's clothing? Tracking Zhao Lei down was not particularly difficult. According to official records, he was a 34-year-old construction worker who had spent years moving between different cities for work. At the time of the investigation, he had been traveling back and forth between Shenyang and his hometown near Yingkou to visit his children after a divorce. On paper, nothing about his life immediately suggested a connection to homicide. But the fact that his ticket had ended up in the possession of a murder victim meant that detectives could not ignore the possibility that the two had crossed paths. Investigators began by reviewing surveillance footage from the train station in Shenyang on April 21st, the same date printed on the ticket. The cameras showed Zhao Lei passing through the station security checkpoint carrying a black shoulder bag. He appeared calm, moving through the crowd like any other traveler heading toward his train. There were no obvious signs of nervous behavior, no attempts to avoid the cameras, nothing that would immediately raise suspicion. But then the footage revealed something confusing. According to the ticket, Zhao Lei had purchased transportation from Shenyang to Shongyucheng, a town located along the route toward Yingkou. Yet when detectives reviewed another set of surveillance recordings, it appeared that Zhao Lei had boarded a train heading in an entirely different direction, toward Liuhe County in Jilin province. That detail caught the investigators' attention instantly. Liuhe County was the exact location where Huang Yujin's body had later been discovered. At first, it looked like a direct connection. If Zhao Lei had traveled to Liuhe on the same day Huang Yujin was believed to have disappeared, and if his train ticket somehow ended up hidden in her clothing, the simplest explanation would be that the two had met during that journey. For a brief moment, investigators believed they might already be closing in on the person responsible for her death. But as the investigation continued, the timeline began to unravel in ways no one expected. When detectives examined additional surveillance footage from the station at Shongyucheng, the location printed on Zhao Lei's ticket, they found something even more puzzling. The cameras there clearly showed Zhao Lei exiting the station shortly after the train arrived. In other words, he had not traveled to Liuhe at all. He had followed the exact route indicated by the ticket. At that point, the investigation faced a contradiction. One set of cameras appeared to show Zhao Lei boarding a train heading toward Liuhe. Another set showed him arriving exactly where his ticket said he would be. For a short time, investigators struggled to reconcile the two pieces of information, wondering whether Zhao Lei might have switched trains or somehow manipulated the system to hide his real destination. The explanation turned out to be far less dramatic, but it also weakened the case against him. Railway staff later confirmed that on that particular day, a train traveling from Shenyang to Xiongyuecheng had been delayed. During the delay, passengers temporarily boarded another train on a nearby platform while waiting for their original route to resume. The confusion in the surveillance footage came from that brief overlap between the two trains. Zhao Lei had not secretly changed destinations. He had simply been waiting during an unexpected schedule disruption. When detectives eventually questioned Zhao Lei directly, his explanation seemed straightforward. He confirmed that the train ticket belonged to him. After arriving at the station, he said he had thrown the ticket away near the exit gate, something many passengers do once a trip is completed. When asked if he had ever met a woman named Huang Yuzhen, he shook his head and insisted he had never heard the name before. Investigators searched through additional video footage around the station entrance, hoping to find a moment where Huang Yuzhen might have picked up the discarded ticket. But no such footage existed. There was no clear image showing the two individuals anywhere near each other. And when forensic analysts compared Zhao Lei's DNA with biological evidence recovered from Huang Yuzhen's body, the results removed the last remaining suspicion. The DNA did not match. With that single test result, Zhao Lei was effectively eliminated as a suspect. For the detectives working the case, the realization was frustrating. The train ticket had initially looked like the first real lead, a tangible object connecting the victim to a specific person. But now it appeared to be nothing more than a coincidence, a piece of evidence that pointed in the wrong direction. The investigation, once again, had returned to uncertainty. Huang Yuzhen had traveled hundreds of kilometers away from her home. She had met someone she trusted enough to follow into a remote mountain area. And yet, despite days of searching through surveillance footage, witness statements, and travel records, the identity of that person remained unknown. But the answer to that mystery had been quietly waiting somewhere else entirely, inside the last series of phone calls Huang Yuzhen made before she died. With the train ticket lead collapsing and Zhao Lei officially eliminated as a suspect, investigators in Liuhe County found themselves back at the beginning of the case. The victim now had a name, Huang Yuzhen, but the identity of the person she had traveled to meet remained a mystery. For detectives, that meant returning to one of the most reliable sources of truth in modern investigations: digital communication records. Unlike physical evidence, which can sometimes mislead investigators through coincidence, phone data often reveals the invisible network of relationships surrounding a victim's final hours. Calls, text messages, and location pings can quietly reconstruct movements and interactions that witnesses might forget or deliberately hide. In Huang Yuzhen's case, investigators believe the answer to the mystery might be hidden within the final conversation she had before disappearing. Police requested detailed call logs from Huang Yuzhen's mobile service provider. When the records arrived, detectives began mapping out every number she had contacted during the final week of her life. Most of the calls were predictable. Several belonged to family members, including the sister who had reported her missing. Others were friends she frequently played mahjong with in Yingkou. There were also repeated calls to Lin Hongchun, the younger boyfriend she had recently broken up with. But among those familiar numbers, one unfamiliar contact appeared again and again. The number did not belong to anyone in Huang Yuzhen's family or social circle. It had appeared frequently during the 3 days leading up to her disappearance. In fact, the call logs showed that the two had spoken repeatedly on April 21st, the exact day investigators believed she had boarded a train and left Yingkou. At first glance, the pattern of calls suggested an ongoing conversation, almost like two people coordinating plans. Several calls lasted only a few minutes, while others stretched close to half an hour. The final recorded call between Huang Yuzhen and that number occurred late in the evening. After that call, her phone went completely silent. For investigators, the importance of that number was immediately clear. If Huang Yuzhen had indeed been planning to meet someone in Shenyang or elsewhere in Liaoning province, this unidentified contact could very well be the person she intended to see. Detectives began tracing the phone number through registration records. The information connected it to a man named Li Jian. Li Jian was 42 years old and lived in Shenyang. Compared with Huang Yuzhen, he appeared to have a relatively stable life. He owned a small trading business that dealt with construction materials and transportation supplies, and his financial records suggested that his income was significantly higher than Huang Yuzhen's. That detail alone caught investigators' attention, because Huang Yuzhen had previously told Lin Hongchun that the man she intended to start a new life with was older and financially successful. The description seemed to fit Li Jian almost perfectly. Detectives then examined location data from Li Jian's phone. The records showed that on April 21st, the day Huang Yuzhen disappeared, his phone had indeed traveled from Shenyang toward the direction of Luhe County. That movement immediately raised alarms within the investigation team. Luhe County was not a major tourist destination, nor was it a common travel route for someone running a construction supply business. Even more troubling was the timing. Li Jian's phone signal had entered the mountainous region outside Luhe late in the evening, roughly within the same time window that forensic experts believed Huang Yuzhen had died. The coincidence was too strong to ignore. At this point, investigators were no longer looking at a vague lead or a random possibility. They were looking at a person who had been in frequent contact with the victim shortly before her death, who matched the description of the mysterious new boyfriend she had mentioned to Lin Hongchun, and whose phone had traveled to the exact location where her body was later discovered. The case was beginning to narrow. Police decided it was time to bring Li Jian in for questioning. When detectives first contacted him, Li Jian did not immediately appear nervous. According to officers present during the initial interview, he spoke calmly and answered most questions without hesitation. He confirmed that he knew Huang Yuzhen. The two had met several months earlier through friends during a social gathering in Shenyang. Over time, they had stayed in contact and occasionally met for meals or entertainment. But when investigators asked him about April 21st, the day Huang Yuzhen disappeared, his explanation became noticeably vague. Li Jian admitted that he had traveled outside Shenyang that evening, but he claimed it was for business reasons related to a supplier he planned to meet. When detectives asked for the supplier's name and contact information, Li Jian hesitated before giving an answer. The explanation felt incomplete, almost rehearsed. Then investigators presented the next piece of information. They told Li Jian that his phone had been traced to the mountains outside Luhe County, the exact area where Huang Yuzhen's body had been discovered days later. For the first time during the interview, Li Jian fell silent. The room suddenly felt different. Detectives watched carefully as his posture shifted and his confidence seemed to disappear. It was the kind of subtle change that experienced investigators notice immediately. The moment when a suspect realizes the police may already know more than he expected. At that moment, the case against Li Jian was still circumstantial. There was no direct evidence linking him to the murder itself, but the pieces were beginning to align in a way that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The phone records had placed him in contact with the victim. The location data had placed him near the crime scene. Now investigators needed to answer the most important question of all. What had happened between Li Jian and Huang Yuzhen on the night she died? As the questioning continued, investigators could sense the subtle shift in Li Jian's demeanor. At the beginning of the interview, he had answered calmly, even casually, as if the conversation were merely a routine inquiry. But once detectives presented the phone records and location data placing him near Luhe County on the night Huang Yuzhen died, the atmosphere inside the interrogation room changed. His responses became slower, and the confidence that had marked his earlier statements began to fade. At first, Li Jian tried to maintain his original explanation. He repeated that his trip toward the mountainous area outside Luhe had been related to business, claiming he had planned to meet a supplier who dealt with construction materials. But when investigators asked for details, the supplier's name, the company involved, or any records confirming the meeting, his answers grew increasingly vague. The supposed business partner could not be located. There were no messages arranging a meeting, no contracts, no proof that the trip had anything to do with his trading company. Detectives then shifted the focus of the interview. Instead of questioning the business story, they returned to the relationship between Li Jian and Huang Yuzhen. When confronted with the call records showing dozens of conversations between the two in the days before her disappearance, Li Jian finally admitted that they had been communicating frequently. The tone of those calls, he explained, had been personal rather than professional. They had met several months earlier through mutual acquaintances and had gradually developed a romantic relationship. That admission confirmed what investigators had already suspected. Huang Yuzhen had not been lying when she told Lin Hongchun about a new man in her life. That man was Li Jian. According to Li Jian, their relationship had moved quickly. Huang Yuzhen often spoke about wanting a more stable life, something different from the financial uncertainty she had experienced after her divorce. Li Jian, on the other hand, presented himself as someone capable of offering that stability. He owned a small business, had his own apartment in Shenyang, and seemed financially secure compared with many people in Huang Yuzhen's social circle. But as the questioning continued, another side of the relationship began to emerge. Investigators discovered that the conversations between the two had not always been harmonious. Messages recovered from Li Jian's phone revealed arguments about money, trust, and expectations for the future. Huang Yuzhen had asked Li Jian for financial help several times, claiming she needed money to settle debts or invest in small business opportunities. While Li Jian had initially provided some support, the messages suggested he had grown increasingly suspicious about how the money was being used. One exchange in particular caught the investigators' attention. Just 2 days before her disappearance, Huang Yuzhen had sent Li Jian a message asking to meet in person. She told him there were things they needed to discuss face-to-face, things that could not be explained over the phone. The wording of the message was vague, but it carried a sense of urgency. That meeting would take place on April 21st. Under continued questioning, Li Jian eventually acknowledged that he had indeed arranged to meet Huang Yuzhen that evening. She had traveled from Yingkou to Shenyang earlier that day, and the two planned to drive somewhere quiet to talk privately. According to Li Jian, Huang Yuzhen had been the one who suggested leaving the city. She said she did not want to discuss personal matters in a crowded restaurant or public space. So they drove north. For hours, the two traveled through smaller roads and rural areas until they reached the mountainous region outside Liuhe County. By then, it was already dark. Snow still covered much of the ground, and the isolated roads were nearly empty at night. Li Jian claimed that once they arrived, the conversation between them quickly turned into an argument. Huang Yuzhen told him she needed a large sum of money, far more than anything she had asked for before. She claimed it was necessary for a new business opportunity that would supposedly benefit both of them. But Li Jian believed the request was unreasonable. According to him, the argument escalated as he refused to give her the money. Investigators listened carefully as he described what happened next. At first, Li Jian insisted that the argument had ended with nothing more than harsh words. He claimed that Huang Yuzhen eventually left the car and began walking away along the dark roadside. Frustrated and angry, he said he simply drove away and returned to Shenyang, leaving her behind in the mountains. But the story had a problem. If that version were true, Huang Yuzhen's body would not have been discovered lying in a field with clear signs of violent death. And investigators knew from the autopsy that the injuries on her body could not have come from exposure to cold or an accidental fall. When detectives pointed out that contradiction, Li Jian's explanation began to collapse. For several minutes, he remained silent, staring down at the table inside the interrogation room. The evidence against him had not yet reached the level of a formal charge, but the pressure of the situation was beginning to close in. Finally, he spoke again. This time, his voice was much quieter than before. What he said next would completely change the direction of the investigation. The interrogation room remained silent for several seconds after Li Jian lowered his head and stopped speaking. Investigators had seen this moment many times before. The point where a suspect realizes that the story they have been repeating can no longer hold together. Every explanation Li Jian had given was beginning to conflict with the physical evidence discovered at the crime scene. The timeline, the injuries, and the location data from his phone were all slowly closing in on him. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded different. The confidence from earlier had completely disappeared. Li Jian admitted that he had not told the truth about what happened in the mountains outside Liuhe County that night. According to his new statement, the argument between him and Huang Yuzhen had escalated far beyond what he had previously described. As they sat inside the car on the isolated roadside, the discussion about money quickly turned hostile. Huang Yuzhen demanded a large amount of cash, insisting that if Li Jian truly cared about their future together, he should be willing to support her plans. But Li Jian had already begun to doubt her intentions. Over the previous weeks, he had grown suspicious that Huang Yuzhen might be using their relationship primarily for financial gain. He believed the request for money would never stop. When he refused again that night, the argument intensified. The two began shouting at each other inside the vehicle. At some point during the confrontation, Huang Yuzhen allegedly threatened to expose details about their relationship to Li Jian's family and business partners. According to his confession, she claimed she would reveal private messages and accuse him of deception if he refused to give her the money she wanted. For Li Jian, that threat triggered a moment of panic. He said he lost control. The exact sequence of events that followed happened quickly. As the argument reached its peak, Li Jian grabbed a long cloth strap that had been lying inside the car, a red boxing hand wrap he used when exercising. In a burst of anger and fear, he wrapped it around Huang Yuzhen's neck and pulled. At first, he claimed he only intended to scare her into stopping the threats. But within seconds, the situation spiraled beyond his control. Huang Yuzhen struggled briefly, then her movement slowed, and then she stopped moving entirely. Inside the quiet interrogation room, Li Jian described the moment he realized what he had done. The darkness outside the car, the silence of the mountains, and the body beside him made the reality impossible to deny. Huang Yuzhen was dead. For several minutes, he sat frozen behind the steering wheel, unsure of what to do next. Eventually, fear replaced shock. Li Jian knew that if he returned to the city with a dead body in the vehicle, his life would be over immediately. So he made a desperate decision to hide what had happened. Under the cover of darkness, he drove a short distance away from the road and dragged Huang Yuzhen's body into a nearby field covered with snow. To make it appear less connected to himself, he attempted to remove anything that might identify her. But during the chaotic process of searching through her clothing, he overlooked one small detail: the train ticket that had been hidden inside the decorative pocket of her coat. That overlooked object would eventually become the first clue that led investigators toward the truth. After leaving the body in the field, Li Jian returned to his car and drove back towards Shenyang. During the journey, he tried to convince himself that the remote location would prevent anyone from finding Huang Yuzhen for a long time. Snowstorms frequently passed through the mountainous region during that time of year, and he believed the body might remain hidden for weeks or even months. But only a few days later, a farmer walking through the area noticed something unusual beneath the melting snow. The discovery triggered a police investigation that slowly began connecting the scattered pieces of evidence: the unidentified body, the hidden train ticket, the missing woman reported in Yingkou, and the mysterious phone calls leading back to Li Jian. One by one, the details formed a chain that pointed directly toward him. In the end, it was not a witness or a confession alone that solved the case. It was the quiet persistence of the investigation. The careful analysis of phone records, surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and the small, overlooked objects that criminals often forget. What Li Jian had believed would disappear into the silence of the mountains instead became the evidence that exposed the truth. And for Huang Yuzhen, the long journey that began with a hopeful trip to meet someone she trusted ended in a remote field hundreds of kilometers from home. A tragic reminder of how quickly trust can turn into fatal betrayal.